renewed U.S. military intervention and operations. And now we have a digital paper trail thanks to a signal chat leak, which raises serious questions renewed U.S. military about renewed U.S. military operations. And about what is being planned and who's deciding and where this war is going to go from here. So we're not necessarily just visiting the past, we're grappling with uh, the present, which feels volatile and deeply consequential for Yemenis. We're lucky to have three speakers who can cut through the noise and help us make sense of what this moment means for Yemen, the region, and the international policy. Um, so first, we have Asher Orkabi. Um, Asher is one of the most esteemed known experts on Yemen. He is a PhD, has a PhD and a research associate and instructor at Harvard University. He was previously an associate research scholar at Princeton University and also a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. He earned his PhD from Harvard University in International History and Middle Eastern Studies and is the author of Beyond the Arab Cold War, The International History of the Yemen Civil War, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017, and Yemen, What Everyone Needs to Know. Over the course of the current conflict, he has contributed to Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, and many other publications, and has commented in both English and Arabic media. We also have with us Samuel Ramani, who is an associate fellow at the Royal United States Service Institute, RUSI, think tank in London, and he's the CEO of Pangea Geopolitical Risk. Samuel is the author of Russia in Africa, Resurgent Great Power or Bellicose Pretender, and Putin's War on Ukraine, Russia's Campaign for Global Counter-Revolution, which were published by Oxford University Press and Hearst in 2023. Samuel frequently advises the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the US Department of State, US Department of Defense, and NATO on defense and security issues, and is also a regular contributor to the BBC World Service, CNN International, and Foreign Policy magazine. And last and not least, we have Sadiq Al-Wasabi. He is a senior fellow with the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies. Al-Wasabi is a seasoned communication and media consultant with extensive experience in journalism and international development. He currently serves as a content creator, focusing on Yemen's situation and the human rights issues. Previously, Al-Wasabi worked as a communication officer for the World Health Organization from 2013 to 2023. He covered humanitarian and health crisis in Yemen, Iraq, and other emergency settings. Before his WHE tenure, he was also a journalist for the Yemen Times and a radio presenter, concentrating on political and human rights. And he holds an MA in media and broadcast production from Queen's University. Okay, let's dive into it. Thank you all for being here. Asher, I'll start with you, so you can give us a bit of a history. Last time you and I were together, actually, were 10 years ago in Harvard Middle East program, talking about Yemen and the start of the Saudi intervention. And the question back then was, who are the Houthis and what is happening? And awkwardly, it's the same question right now. So I'm gonna ask you, who are the Houthis? What are their goals? Why are we entangled with them?
Thank you, Fatima. I have very good memories of 10 years ago. And in fact, the answer hasn't really changed. What's changed is the regional dynamics and the international world and the way that they've approached Yemen. But the Yemeni conflict itself is really the same. Right? In order to understand the Houthis, we need to understand the conflict in Yemen because they don't exist in a vacuum. Right? When Ansar Allah arrives to Sana'a in September of 2014, it's the culmination of multi-year conflict with the Yemeni central government. The Ansar Allah movement, known colloquially as the Houthi movement, was a conglomerate of legitimate regional grievances against the central government in Sana'a. There were both regional grievances that were expressed by southern separatist movements and those in the north. There was a great deal of economic, social, political marginalization that had occurred over not just a 10-year period, but over a 60-year period, really since the 1960s. There was a civil war during the 1960s. The old social hierarchy was upended. Those tribal groups in the north from 1968, presumably since 2014, were relatively marginalized, right? Both in terms of general construction, right? Electrification, social, political, economic investment up north was marginalized, and certainly they were second-class citizens. It was an upending of the entirety of Yemen's social hierarchy. And not only that, but there was also an upending of the religious hierarchy within Yemen. The old Imamate Mutawakkila Kingdom of Yemen that had existed until 1968 was centered around the Zaidi religion specifically, and a lot of cultural heritage that comes with it. The Yemeni state had moved beyond that. And then all the way up until the downfall of the state after the Arab Spring, many of these grievances, northern grievances in particular, came to the front as the central state splintered and fell apart. Ali Abdullah Saleh was taken down from power. And the Houthi movement, which ultimately came to Sana'a, was part of this culmination of northern grievances. But what often happens when there's a strongman or a particular family at the center of these movements, that entire coalition of grievances, which were very legitimate initially in 2014, became far closer to an autocracy, led by this Houthi family. And over 10 years, that Houthi family and the Houthi movement metastasized into a very negative movement. All of those original grievances were not addressed to the same extent. And it became just a fiefdom of a single family running an entire state, one that has been fueled by regional tensions and international support as well. And we can certainly elaborate on that. But that's in a nutshell, the way I see the history of the Houthi movement, where they come from and where they are today.
Thanks, Asher. Sadiq, I'm gonna jump to you. Maybe you can also walk us I mean, Asher just covered it beautifully, but maybe you can walk us of your understanding of them, people's understanding of the Houthi movement, their goals. I'm kind of interested in their goals. We hear so much about their, slogan, their goals in Yemen. Can you speak a little bit more to that? The entire proxification process as well.
Well, Fatma, this question has been repeatedly raised and circulated over the past 10 years, but especially so recently. And I agree with Asher that the answer to this question has changed over time. To put it simply and clearly, the Houthis are northern Yemeni group rooted in the Zaydi branch of Shia Islam. Unlike broader Zaydism, which historically allowed contested leadership, the Houthis insist on exclusive divine legitimacy for Hashemite descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, and they seek to revive historical Yemeni Zaydi imamate abolished in 1962. So the Houthis evolved into an armed insurgency, especially after the 2004 killing of founder Hussein al-Houthi. And their ideology includes strong anti-Western and anti-Zionist stance. Over time, Houthis have been influenced by their ties with Iran, and they have integrated certain 12-er Shia elements, such as admiration for Iran's Islamic Revolution and celebrating Ashura incidents. And I think this is just pragmatic adaptation to extend their influence through alignment with Iran's axis of resistance. So to cut the long story short, the Houthis believe in their divine rights to govern, I think this idea is widely ignored globally, and this is what drive their actions and resistance.
But they have some kind of a global agenda as well. And I'm curious if you can speak to that, because one of the things we keep hearing from people in Yemen is that they really as you mentioned, they veered off the Zaidi sect and they're becoming more of Twelvers, more aligned with Iran. And I'm gonna jump to Sam in a little bit to talk about their alignment with Russia, but wanted to also understand, you know, this entire issue of them being controlled by Iran or not.
So yeah, the ambitions of Houthis is not restricted locally, and we can see in their statements that they have ambition also to govern and to control Mecca and Medina and to storm Riyadh, but also in the mentality and the ideology of Houthis, they have firm belief that they should govern and rule the world, and for them this is a divine right, and they firmly believe in this ideology, and this is what drives fighters of Houthis to go to the battlefields and fight. And this is the dangerous idea that the international community is not realizing and is not aware of.
Thank you, Sadiq. And Sam, uh, Sam, given your work on Russia's global posture, how do you see the Houthis? How do you see Moscow's ties with Houthis and Iran in Yemen? Could Russia be, for example, leveraging Yemen as part of a broader strategy to challenge US influence in the Red Sea and the Gulf? So if you can kind of like speak to that, and also sort of like the historical context of these growing ties with the Houthis, because they kind of started with Saleh, right?
Right.
It started with Saleh, and then it
Yeah.
Russians weren't really happy about Houthis taking over at one point, but now they're happy about it.
Yeah, it's a great question, Fatima. Yeah, I think that just to look at the Russian policy towards the Houthis, you definitely do see a striking change from the early stages of the Houthi coup d'etat, when they certainly weren't very happy about it, and then on towards the assassination of Saleh in 2017, where Sergei Lavrov described the Houthis as a movement that had radicalized, and now on to the increasingly close diplomatic cooperation between them, and also threats of prospective military cooperation between Russia and the Houthis. So when the Houthis first emerged on the Yemeni political scene, the Russians and the Houthis did not really have that much in the way of ties or any kind of compatible objectives. The Russians, during the 1994 Yemeni civil war, had tried to position themselves as a mediator and to maintain some degree of a balancing strategy. And even when the Houthis started moving in a more anti-American direction and away from some of their rhetoric about inclusivity, and they were criticizing Saleh's relationship with the United States over the Iraq War, and the Russians opposed the Iraq War, the Russians were keeping them still at arm's length. And we saw that kind of repeat itself during the Arab Spring, when the Russians were typically supporting authoritarian stability across the region, and they would have favored the retention of Saleh. They acquiesced to the replacement with Hadi because that was a president going on to a vice president, but they certainly were not supporting any kind of grassroots movements that would be promoting revolutionary change in a more radical fashion. So that's why the Houthis were kind of also shunned, because they represented the threatening aspects of the Arab Spring and the militarism that occurred in the region. And but as of 2014 and 2015, obviously, the Houthi rise coincided with the breakdown of Russia-West relations over the annexation of Crimea and the subsequent imposition of Western sanctions against Russia. And that led to the Russians taking on a bit more of a nuanced stance. So the Russians did not support the Houthi coup, but they did oppose the Saudi-led military intervention. There was actually a quote from Nikolai Patrushev, the hawkish national security advisor to Putin, in his Vestia, where he warned that the Saudi-led military intervention and American support would lead to the Somalilization of Yemen, basically. So making it that the worst-case scenario, that Yemen would become a terminal, decades-long failed state, just like Somalia, and a breeding ground for extremism and chaos. So the Russians were opposed to the Saudi-led intervention. They were going to veto UN Resolution 2216, but they managed to get a bit of a slight dilution or a water down of it. So they were the only country out of the 15 to abstain from it. So 1401, they were in that position. They also maintained a diplomatic presence in Sana'a as well as a diplomatic presence in Aden, and they maintained that until the assassination of Saleh when they withdrew all their personnel from Sana'a in 2017. And the Russians continued this kind of approach where they were kind of engaging without endorsing the Houthis. They were kind of engaging with them, legitimizing them as having a role in the potential future peace settlement, inviting Houthi-led delegations led by Mohammed Abdul Salam from the Muscat office to Moscow, but not really pledging any kind of fealty to their objectives, maintaining ties also with the Hadi government, with the Southern Transitional Council, trying to show that they were balancing and playing all sides off each other. It was a form of strategic non-alignment that really took hold. At times, the Russians would even criticize the Houthis for some of their transnational actions, like their firing of missiles and drones into the United Arab Emirates, which allegedly some people say led to the UAE also abstaining from Russia's invasion of Ukraine resolution, though that's a bit of circumstantial reporting. And also, the Russians try to shield Iran as much as possible from any kind of allegations of arming the Houthis, as by stalling the UN panel of experts reports and vetoing or threatening to veto any resolution that tied Iran to the arming of the Houthis. And this is around in 2018, 2019. But we really started seeing this movement from opposition to the Houthi objectives to some kind of strategic non-alignment, arm's length engagement without endorsement, into a broader full-fledged partnership started taking place after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you started seeing some of the Houthi leadership started expressing sympathy, if not for the invasion itself, but certainly for some of Russia's wars and crusades against NATO. Interestingly, people like Mohammed al-Bukaidi would often criticize China for being a bit too acquiescent to the West, but would be more willing to embrace Russia and to show support. The Houthis threw their solidarity behind the Russians after the Crocus City terror attack, kind of accusing and repeating some of the SVR narratives that the British and the Americans were trying to use Islamism inside Russia as the fifth column to instigate unrest against Russia. Even Bukaidi pushed those narratives on his social media platforms. And
Would
the
be good
really
to
brought the
kind
Russians
of
together.
would be good to kind of like explain who's al-Bukhaiti and others for the people who may not know. So as
Yeah,
your
so
the
Muhammad
title.
al-Bukaiti is well, the Bukaiti family has got pretty interesting branches, right? They got but Muhammad al-Bukaiti was a member of the political bureau, the Politburo of the Houthis. He's got one brother who's kind of gone the completely other way, but he's got other family members who are kind of supporting him. So he's a senior official, powerful person within the Houthi inner circle and the inner leadership. And up until recently, he had a pretty widely followed X account, which just got suspended. But it was a good way of kind of seeing how the Houthis kind of viewed domestic and international events. It was kind of useful to look at. I follow it very regularly. So, with regards to just wrapping up this question up, like with regards to the when the final straw broke the camel's back when it came to Russia supporting the Houthis was when the Americans and the West started greenlighting the supply of long-range missiles to Ukraine. So Atacams and Storm Shadows and Scalps, and started giving them limited openness to striking inside Russian territory. After that, there were a whole flurry of ultranationalist commentators on Telegram inside Russia, including Sergei Mardan, who's one of the big far-right extremists. He was pro-Iran. He says Iran's going to crush Israel. That was one of his things after October 7th. People like him, various Duma members, various others, urged Vladimir Putin to arm the Houthis and encourage them to strike ships in the Red Sea as a way of retaliating against NATO, using the Ukrainians as a proxy against Russia. And Vladimir Putin alluded to the possibility that we could arm your adversaries at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum in response to the West attacking us, and that's going to be completely legitimate. And then after that, there were some serious discussions about the movement of anti-ship missiles, Victor Bout potentially serving as an interlocutor, though that was not necessarily confirmed, the Russian arms dealer. I think that right now there's some evidence that Russia's intelligence has provided support for the Houthis. They've helped them to some degree with targeting. They've negotiated a settlement with the Houthis to exempt their own ships from being targeted. There's one accidental strike on a Russian oil tanker, but nothing else. But there isn't that much evidence that they've actually, formed a full-fledged military alliance of the kind that the Telegram channels are talking about. But certainly they've drawn closer together. Certainly they're now the partner of choice for the Russians inside Yemen, and Russia would definitely endorse and back them as the de facto authorities in Sana'a and northern Yemen in the event of any kind of longer-term settlement that deals with the final status issues of the conflict. So the Russians and the Houthis do have a strong alignment, which complements and acts as a force multiplier for their broader relationship with Iran. The only thing that I think is holding back the Houthis from the Russians are backing the Houthis even more forcefully is the fact that Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman made it very clear to Putin that any kind of supply of anti-ship missiles in large quantity would be a red line. And also because of the dependency of the Russians right now on the Emirati financial system, in particular Dubai. So they don't want to be seen as an enabler of any kind of Houthi strikes on Saudi Arabia and the UAE if this conflict eventually leads to a reheating of that vector. So that's kind of how I see it overall. Evolution over time from not liking the Houthis, even though they had some common anti-American sympathies, to now becoming the partner of choice for the Russians.
That was an amazing and really thorough overview, and I don't know how you managed to condense it in such a short time. But not only did you speak about Russia, but you also spoke about the Gulf, which is very important and is my next question. And sort of this is to both Asher and Sadiq also to think about this, but we're seeing renewed US escalation at the moment against Houthi targets. And this is definitely, I mean, it happened during the Biden administration when the Houthis decided to rally their masses around supporting the Palestinian cause and launch missiles towards Israel and destabilize the Red Sea. So that warranted a response from the United States. It couldn't have gone unanswered. My and ironically, this was a part of the warnings that Saudi Arabia had for the United States for a very long time. And it's also, I'll back up and I'll say this is part of the warnings that the Yemen government had initially against the Houthis, because they were warning that they have expansionist objectives, and they know how to use military because they started with really humble numbers. These are people who are like no more than 5,000 at one point. People estimated they were anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 when they started back in the day in 2004. It wasn't a big force, and look at them now. So the Yemeni government was saying we're fighting a group that was saying death to America, not costing the US a single dollar. And then the Saudis were saying the same. The Saudis and Emiratis are like, we're fighting this war on your behalf because they're going to destabilize us. They're going to destabilize the region on behalf of Iran. And the US now is doing it directly. I want to go through, I mean, you know, I mean, Saudi Arabia has some kind of a tacit agreement right now with the Houthis. There's some kind of an understanding. We haven't seen active military participation from Saudi Arabia for a while, but Asher, if you can kind of like let us know some of the critical lessons from the war over the past 10 years. And again, I know when I say 10 years at war, just 10 years from when it started. Yemen is not actively at war, not actively at war everywhere. Certain areas were definitely liberated and kept safe from the Houthis. But after that, why is it that there was no US support? Why is this reluctant support? Kind of lessons that we can learn from the Saudi and Emirati intervention in Yemen.
Thanks, Fatima. I think that the key to understanding the Saudi intervention and what their goals were is to understand why they entered the first offensive, the Saudi offensives, was in 2009. The first time Saudis sent actual ground troops into northern Yemen in order to put down what was then the Ansar Allah movement. Again, was a very small movement and has since grown into a much larger one. The Saudi goal in 2009 was the same as the Saudi goal in 2014 and 15, was southern border security. And the concern for what was previously a very porous border. Prior to 2014-15, the Saudis were already constructing a border fence between the two countries. And this is significant because there are three regions that are culturally and linguistically and tribally Yemeni, the three borders of Asir, Najran, and Jizan, all conquered in 1933, still remain a point of contention between Yemenis and Saudis. And in fact, the Houthis themselves, one of the first slogans, in addition to "Death to America," was also "We're going to take Asir back." The Asir movement was very significant in the north, and the Saudis were certainly concerned about this. Right, so that sets up the Saudi intervention both in 2009 against the Houthi movement, again in 2015. Was the border security. The irony is that the border security, at least during that period, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more that the Houthis gained attention, international attention, the more support that was received, the larger the movement became, and the more that the Saudi administration needed to now worry about border security. So it's the great irony of Saudi intervention that it may not have actually increased border security, although since 2021, it seems that there's a relative understanding between the Houthi movement and the Saudis that attacks don't occur over that border. And I'm happy to elaborate further into why this happened, why Saudi interventions failed. Much of it has to do with misguided humanitarian aid and international diplomacy. That it seemed every moment that the Houthi movement was on the verge of defeat, it seemed like some international actor came in order to call for a ceasefire to save the movement, which ironically ended up legitimizing them. I'm happy to elaborate on that further if the discussion goes in that direction.
Sure. But Sadiq, more or less the same question, but also would be interesting to know. I mean, I remember when the Saudi intervention happened, I got a call from a colleague from a Gulf embassy who said, "Don't worry about it. It's just going to be a few months. We're going to teach Houthis a lesson, and it's going to be swift, and everything's going to be okay." So, um, uh, and the perception, and I think a lot of us were taken aback and thinking, can dialogue happen? There was a lot of resistance at the beginning to the Saudi-led intervention, which, in my perspective, I'm not even seeing that same resistance anymore after a decade of people being under the Houthis. But I want you to let me know, have you seen any kind of shift in attitude? So, in the attitude towards the Saudi coalition, how did this conflict impact Yemeni people? What lessons can be learned from that intervention?
Yeah, well, I think over the past 10 years, Yemeni's perception of Saudi Arabia's involvement have evolved significantly. Initially, you remember when Saudi Arabia launched, as you said, when they launched their operations in 2015, many Yemenis saw the intervention as an effective and powerful step to stop Houthi advances and restore the legitimate government and President Hadi. I vividly remember the widespread hope at that time that the intervention would be swift and decisive. But I could say that this optimism gradually shifted to skepticism and disappointment. Yemenis become more and more frustrated by the prolonged conflict and economic hardships. And they also become concerned by a growing sense of dependency rather than real and genuine partnership. So I can clearly sense and read these days the sentiment among Yemenis who have lost trust, not just in Saudi Arabia's intervention, but in all external involvement generally. I can also see the fatigue and distrust in their voices and words. I think they've realized these interventions often prioritize foreign interests rather than addressing Yemeni concerns and countering Houthis properly. And we saw the statements from the US Secretary of Defense, who clearly said that they're not concerned with the civil war in Yemen, but rather with preventing the targeting of a vital waterway. So looking back at lessons learned, I think one of the toughest lessons over these 10 years is that every time a deal was made with the Houthis, it was in step toward peace. I think it was a catastrophic mistake that only made them more powerful. Yemenis are outraged that the Houthis have been emboldened over the past decade by actions not only from the international community and the UN, but by Saudi Arabia themselves. Many now concerned that if the Trump administration pursues similar concessions towards Houthis, it could be the final straw and will empower the Houthis like never before.
We kind of know that they will at one point. Today we saw Khamenei's aide signal that they are ready to talk with the United States, so that should be interesting. And I think at one point, given the fact that we're seeing deal making in Russia and the Ukraine, it sort of like speaks to the imagination of the current administration that could, um, and especially an administration that had once struck a deal with the Taliban, that this is really not far-fetched. And I think the US administration sent a pretty strong message when they said that they don't want to get involved in the civil war in Yemen, that they don't necessarily want to dislodge the Houthis. Although in the Signal chat group, it was really clear that they were targeting their leadership, which was an interesting thing to see. So maybe with that, I'll jump to ask Samuel, sort of like, um, do you think, with the current US approach and the failures that we've seen over the past 10 years, in which we've really couldn't, where we saw the Houthis' power grow, do you think the Houthis can be contained?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, that there obviously are two sides of the coin now in Washington when it comes to the how what to do with the Houthis. There's one group of people who basically say that there's no military solution, they cannot be defeated. After all these years of strikes, they've just been getting stronger. But on the other side of the equation, there are those who do believe that military strikes can deal a decisive blow, potentially further contribute to a spiral that parses the discontents maybe in the Houthi controlled areas from the Houthi leadership. And maybe it's also, as Asher noted, it's been the role of the international community to kind of empower the Houthis by calling for ceasefires and by calling for a lot of measures that benefited them at times when they may have actually been potentially in a weaker position. So really, time will tell whether their military intervention is accurate and which of these two perspectives is more coming willing to come true. I mean, certainly it's possible that the military strikes, depending on the level of intelligence, would be able to degrade some of their long-range missile or drone storages or other things that would be interesting. I don't think that at this point in time the Houthis are going to try to broaden the conflict into something more regional. I think that we saw, for example, in the middle of last year, there was a moment where the Saudis and the Americans were pressuring basically the central bank of Yemen, right, in Aden, to limit financial restrictions on the Houthis, right? And the Houthis warned that they would go to war with Saudi Arabia and their allies, which implicitly meant the UAE and many other Gulf countries, and possibly even stepping up further their attacks on Red Sea infrastructure if that was not removed. In the end, there was an economic de-escalation accord between the Yemeni government and the Houthis, that some people said was brokered by the Saudis, and that whole thing kind of dialed down. So I think that the Houthis will, obviously these strikes can play a role. I think the Houthis are kind of pragmatic and canny enough not to go overboard, not to go completely ballistic and start a regional war that might lead to their further detriment. But I also think that a combination of sustained economic pressure, cutting off their transnational networks, which I think is really important, dealing with supporters and enablers, not just in Tehran, but also in Baghdad, their relationships, degrading Hezbollah also is a benefit for them. The fall of Assad is also a benefit for weakening the Houthis, and their legitimizers, which are Russia and China, will play an important role in weakening them. And the combination of military pressure, the disconnect between the Houthi leadership and the elites, the abandonment of some of their ideologies, like even their protection of Zionism and movement towards Twelver Shiism in alignment with Iran, the authoritarianism, the repression in their areas, the inability to crack down on corruption, which was something that was important for their rebellion against Hadi. All these type of things could eventually lead to the movement kind of imploding from within, in a grassroots fashion. So we shouldn't be looking at military options as the only solution, but we should also not regard them as completely ineffective, because they, combined with other measures, might lead to a more complete outcome where the Houthis eventually do find their grip on major cities unsustainable. And as we saw with Assad in Syria, not saying that this is going to happen here, but we saw with that regimes that don't have popular legitimacy, that are backed by external powers, and have a lot of the sclerotic elements that we saw can fall very, very quickly and unexpectedly. So we should watch and see what happens.
That's like music to a lot of people's ears because it's what a lot of Yemenis have been talking about. I mean, Hashir, I want to ask you, do you think this movement can actually crumble from the inside? And again, that's a question for both you and Sadiq. I mean, I remember again, like going back to 10 years ago, or maybe 1 year after the war, or after the intervention, you were talking, and you brought up a picture of Ahmad Saleh, and I thought, he doesn't know what he's talking about. There was just a revolution. This cannot be real. But you had an interesting forecast. And maybe if you can talk to like about all of the current dynamics, openings for other groups. There's a lot of concern about a leadership vacuum in Yemen because the anti-Houthi alliance is not that strong. So they're strong in one objective, but we don't know what's going to come next. So if you can speak to that, that would be great.
All right. Thanks, Fatima. I do remember that, and I do remember your comments about me bringing up the Saleh family again. But I think at the same time that I brought up the Saleh family, I also brought up a Facebook group in Libya at the same time, that within several months of Gaddafi's downfall, there was a Facebook group, an indigenous Facebook group of Libyans called Aina Gaddafi. Where are the good old days where Gaddafi was the only lunatic with missiles and guns and etc. Now half of the country is vying with each other to become warlords, right? And this was the time in 2014, 15. So I think this is certainly the case for Yemenis, and this is obviously a very unscientific view of just social media trends and things that people understand. Is the last name of Saleh, the irony, it used to be readily associated with corruption, the downfall of the state. But now the idea of somebody from the Saleh family coming back into prominence is something familiar, right? It almost seems like it's something that can provide a degree of stability. So certainly the irony of histories is that the same family that was synonymous with corruption and the downfall of the state may actually be something that people can ground onto and give them a sense of hope for the future. Certainly, Ahmed Saleh, who was just recently taken off the Treasury Department's restricted list for his various different dealings in the Emirates and elsewhere in the Gulf. But more specifically on the ground, Tariq Saleh himself, Ali Abdullah Saleh's nephew, who controls or at least is semi-affiliated with a very effective group, or at least previously effective military group on the ground, as we saw both in Hudaydah and elsewhere in the Tihama region. And so there certainly is a possibility that on the ground military forces would be given the green light once again. They were given the red light on numerous occasions by international organizations, whether it's UN special envoys running into the scene in Marib or in Hudaydah in 2018, and Marib being in 2021, to have a ceasefire only to watch as the Houthi allied forces conquered those various regions and took control both of Hudaydah and Marib. There certainly are prospects for anti-Houthi militias and groups to destabilize the region from within, something that Samuel was alluding to. At the same time, you mentioned the fact that there's a leadership vacuum, and I think this is something that the Saudi coalition has been thinking about. If you have a internationally recognized government sitting in a bunch of hotel rooms in Riyadh, you don't have the local legitimacy. So the attempt, at least with the presidential council, was to both use half the council as that remaining group, the Riyadh-based government, but the other half of the council trying to grab onto individuals like Tariq Saleh and Sindani. In other words, trying to create a legitimacy by grabbing onto those locals who still had familiar names, who still had local following. So there certainly was that vision as early as 2021, 2022 to grab onto that. I think that the efforts to pull down the Houthi regime from within hit up against the brick wall on October 7th, when the Houthi regime noticed or made the correct realization that they can use their propaganda to gain legitimacy amongst the Yemenis. They can actualize their propaganda of death to America, death to Israel, and it'd be far more difficult for the internationally recognized government in Yemen to challenge the Houthis. And I remember a phone call, certainly around November, after the November of the previous year, trying to make sense of what the Houthis were doing. And I remember calling up a number of friends within the Yemeni government, the internationally recognized government, and saying, I think you may need to look for a new job because it's going to be impossible for you to put together a public relations response to the Houthi attack without appearing to be either pro-Zionist or anti-Houthi, right? You can't be both. So they played, the Houthi leadership that has played this game. They played it well. They grabbed onto something that they can create from within a new degree and level of popular legitimacy. It's possible that under the current administration in DC, they may have overplayed their hand. And they may be pushing their own legitimacy a little bit too far. And we may see, as hopefully Samuel predicted, a downfall of the Houthi regime from within, right? That legitimacy that gained them stock after October 7th may only take them so far in terms of giving them legitimacy within Yemen itself.
Thank you, Asher, and that's a really good point. And also, Yemenis are aware that they are being used for this purpose, that the Houthis are, I mean, it's heartbreaking because when you see these demonstrations after Friday prayers and, you know, tens of thousands of people filling the street and chanting death to America, they are being terrorized to say that. And if you are not in the square to express that opinion, then you don't receive your gas canister, you get thrown in jail. You know, they have so much power on the ground to mobilize people, use them in such a way. And I know a lot of people that I speak to, they say they don't have any other choice but to be there and attend. So it's this monopoly of power that they have is quite serious. And people are, fed up with it. They don't want also like an international process, such as the ones that we've had with the UN to legitimize it. Which kind of brings me to the issue of the FTO designation. And I do want to ask, both you, Asher, and Sadiq as well, and Sam, but maybe I'll jump to Sam. Do you think this FTO designation is going to be helpful in terms of weakening the Houthis or achieving any objectives that it's set to do?
Yeah.
And can you unmute yourself, Sam? Thank you.
Yeah, I've just having a tech issue here. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really interesting question. I would say that the FTO designation, one of the problems with it in the past was that there were two problems. Number one, of course, it was inconsistently applied. You saw the Trump administration impose it, the Biden administration take it off, then it come back again, and it started being seen, as something that was partisan or inconsistent. In terms of U.S. policy, and if the U.S. was so inconsistent, that made it impossible for European countries to join the Americans in imposing that, even when Europeans were seeing severe damage to their ships, or countries like Japan or Germany or others which are seeing severe damage to their ships from applying that. The second thing was that there was this narrative that the FTO designation would do absolutely nothing to the Houthis economically because their economic networks are largely under sanctions by the United Nations in 2014, since 2014 onwards. And the only thing that it would do was be limiting food aid and be limiting humanitarian aid. So that narrative that the FTO designation was kind of completely feckless and it was just something that was going to make Yemen's humanitarian crisis worse and increase the power of some of the Houthi siege mentality rhetoric and anti-Western rhetoric to strengthen the regime from within were kind of the things that kind of diluted it and made it not work. So I think that it's not because the FTO designation doesn't work. It's just because I think some of the narratives around it were kind of a bit specious, and also the inconsistency in its application has really prevented it from really moving the needle or weakening the Houthis. That being said, I think that there certainly could be ways in which it might be able to weaken and dismantle some of the Houthis' transnational networks, which I think we should be paying attention to. I don't think for now it's going to do anything to dilute the Houthi relationship with Russia because Russia has kind of viewed movements like the Houthis as a national liberation movement, very similar to how they view Hamas or they view Hezbollah or they view others. Like they see them as like a Lebanese nationalist movement or a Palestinian nationalist movement fighting against imperial aggression from Israel and from the West. It's very Cold War-esque. It's very Soviet-esque, but it's still what you see coming from officials in Moscow when I talk and engage with them over the years. But it may actually do something to impact the Houthis' relationships with some other countries. I think we should also be playing a potential role in watching how this designation impacts the Houthi relationship with China, because some of these, because one tranche of the Chinese sanctions that dealt with oil to Iran also dealt with the supply of China and imports and economic cooperation with the Houthis. So and China historically has had a degree of caution sometimes when it's pretty clear that they would be within the firing line of secondary sanctions, whether that be their temporary scale back of purchasing oil from Iran after the maximum pressure campaign, whether that be an arm's length stance towards North Korea arming of Russia, only kind of using Qingdao port and some other vessels to kind of support it, and also reluctance to enable the Russian shadow fleet. That could lead to potentially China distancing themselves. And we've already seen a situation where China did pursue oil extraction agreements with the Houthis only to pull them back about a week later. This was about 2 years ago. It was in 2022 when they were concerned about the risk of an FTO designation coming. Another country that I think we should be paying close attention to how this FTO designation might impact it is the Houthi relationship with Iraq, because the Houthis have been present in Iraq since 2011. You saw an establishment of a relationship with Hyder al-Abadi's government, and the Houthis have obviously robust ties with Kataib Hezbollah, Harakat Hezbollah, al-Nujaba, and other the Badr organization and other Iranian proxies, and they've used Iraqi logistics and Iraqi intelligence and some of the intelligence sharing hubs there to help and assist some of those strikes against Israel. That's something that one of my Rusi colleagues has written about. I recommend you look at that report. And there was obviously some controversy about the one of the senior former Iraqi ministers or prime minister, right, attending the Palestine conference in Sana'a over the weekend. But I think that, yeah, we should be watching for how this FTO designation impacts some of their transnational networks that are outside of the Iranian orbit or outside of the orbit that doesn't really care about it, like Russia, particularly how they're dealing with China and Iraq, because it can lead to longer term international isolation and maybe a weakening of some of their funding sources over the course of time. So that's where I think it could play a role.
Thank you. If anyone wanted to weigh in on that question, otherwise I'll move to Asher, please. Thank you.
So let me just follow up on Sam's question just for a moment relating to humanitarian aid in particular. And I think that the terrorist designation for the FTO designation is significant because it does cut off, specifically because it does cut off that humanitarian aid and food aid pipeline. And that's significant because most of the benefit of the food aid pipeline, humanitarian aid, is actually being benefited by the international NGOs, the INGOs. NGOs like Oxfam and many others have taken full advantage of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen to increase the amount of donations that are coming in with significant overheads for their general operations, with only honestly pennies to the dollar that actually end up in Yemen. And it's not necessarily a positive model that's being used. A lot of the INGOs, even UN World Food Program, food dumping on Yemen. It's created a great deal of harm for Yemeni farmers that for centuries have produced the wheat. Yemeni farmers take a great deal of pride in their ability to grow food in the breadbasket of the Arabian Peninsula. And by dumping food on Yemeni farmers, you're pushing them into a cycle of poverty, and one in which has gotten worse as the amount of food aid has increased, and ultimately as Yemeni farmers can compete with free food. But I think the largest problem here is the fact that humanitarian foreign aid has really enriched a lot of the Houthi warlords, Houthi allied warlords within the country, those who are able to control the network, the transit of humanitarian aid, food aid, have enriched themselves in a very significant way, and also a way that's created and funded partially this authoritarian government. So that international hegemonic way of delivering humanitarian food aid, if the FTO does anything to cut that off, I think that would be fantastic for Yemenis, because you can really push a lot of the localization, that happens far more efficient, actually supporting Yemeni farmers and supporting some very high quality indigenous Yemeni groups, rather than constantly dumping aid in a way that's irresponsible, and ultimately disincentivize any end to this conflict, because there are people who are gaining a great deal of wealth, and you've created artificially, through this humanitarian aid, you've created one of the largest sources of national product, the GMP for the entire country. And that's really unfortunate for those of us who've been to Yemen, who understand how the country runs, to see what the humanitarian aid and food aid has done to the local economy. It's really, I think that is the greatest travesty that's happened throughout this entire conflict. So the silver lining of the FTO would be, hopefully there's a rethinking and a recalibration of this international humanitarian aid model that has really been relatively negative.
Thank you, Asher. That was very well put. And Sadiq, probably on the same point, because a lot of people were making the point that UN personnel are getting kidnapped. The aid is actually also not reaching its destination. So if you can speak to us on the impact on that level, in terms of, the FTO sanctions on the Houthi leadership, and its impact on the humanitarian issue in Yemen. And unmute yourself, please.
Yes, Fatma, this point is really tricky. Looking back at 2017 and 2018 during the Stockholm Agreement and the heated discussions on famine, and Houthis were pushing hard to stop advancement toward Hodeidah, and the card of famine has been used. Then 2 years later, when they were redesignated as terrorist organization group, they pushed hard to lift this designation, and they used their lobbies, and they used their media arms and think tanks to convince the international community about the devastating impact of this designation. But now the factors have totally changed. Any discussions about the humanitarian impact are seen as defending Houthis and trying to and helping them avoid these sanctions and designation. So what has been pushed in 2018 or 2020 is not applicable now in 2025. And also, there's another factor. There's no Saudi airstrikes, which make it so challenging and difficult for Houthis to convince the international community to stop these airstrikes. Now, with the U.S. and Israel airstrike going on Yemen, Houthis find themselves like in a very critical situation. They lost allies and they lost even the Western media that for a long time defended Houthis, even indirectly, and pushed for a narrative that served Houthis. All of these factors are not there these times, and I think this is one of the most difficult factors Houthis are facing. So the discussion about whether FTO redesignation would cause humanitarian difficulties is really sensitive, and even the UN agencies and international organizations become wary about this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sadiq. I mean, it's interesting because and you've done so much work on Western media, and you've seen like it, seeing these shifts are interesting. I mean, I was wondering if you wanted to talk to us a little bit more about kind of like Western media analysis and perception on the conflict, um, and how it affected Yemen's war, because just the coverage back then is so different than the coverage now. And as a communication specialist, and you see the communication messages that are coming out of the Houthi areas as well, they're not been very helpful. And I feel, I mean, and it's frustrating because they keep getting, I mean, even now that they are exposed through their attacks to the Red Sea, on the Red Sea and on Israel, and now that they're exposed as an Iranian proxy, they still keep getting gifts like the Signal chat that was there, because it kind of showed the indecisiveness and the decision, I mean, the decision making in the United States was like, should we strike them now or maybe in a month? And we could perhaps delay it for a month. And it kind of also felt like they have an opening to influence in the United States and to stop these attacks from coming on them as well. So that indecisiveness that was seen at the highest of levels, the lack of strategy and urgency is such a, I think it gives them the breathing room, because when they're seeing this, they're going to go like, oh, we're in it for the long game. We still have time to play, if they can't make up their mind about who we are and what we're doing.
Yeah, Fatima, I can confidently say that for years, our narrative as Yemenis has been hijacked by those with a clear agenda, political agenda, and the price paid by the Yemeni people has been disastrous. And because Houthis have used this narrative in their favors, and they recruited children, and they in their recruitment sessions and literature, they use the Western media reports to prove that the world is standing with us. So different pieces and articles paint the Houthis as heroic freedom fighters, clearly, and Western media and leftist policy circles have repeatedly aligned with the Houthis, even if indirectly. And the Houthis' crimes against Yemenis, like blowing up homes, recruiting children, planting landmines, and other crimes, have been underreported and or misrepresented and ignored by the media, by the Western media. And ironically, some crimes of Houthis were even portrayed as acts of resistance rather than crimes against Yemenis. So I think many media campaigns in the West have hijacked the truth for political agenda, especially against Saudi Arabia. And as Yemenis, we pay the price of the hatred of some media outlets and their calculations against Saudi Arabia. I think as Yemenis, we need to restore our narrative instead of letting others spreading misleading narrative that helped in empowering the Houthis and prolonging the war.
And I mean, I guess for a very long time, the Houthis were just really focused on one message, which is get Saudi Arabia out, fight, get Saudi Arabia out, while everybody else in Yemen was like, oh no, we've had different issues. We've had, multiple issues that made it very difficult to unite. But I think what unites everybody right now is, this idea that the Houthis are really exposed as agents of Iran. They're not working on the national Yemeni interest. They're not making friends with anybody in the region. They're making friends with an alliance that is catastrophic and bringing bombs and airstrikes into the country. So Yemenis want to live in peace, and this group does not want to give them peace because they don't have any incentive. Why give up this power that they've acquired for them and for their Ahl al-Bayt and all of the ruling family? So that's terrible. But we have about 30 minutes left or less. So I want to jump into the audience question. And one of the questions that I am seeing that is trigger is like, was the Stockholm Agreement a strategic mistake? Thank you, Azat Waqti, for asking this question. Um, I've written a lot about this. It's a sore topic for many Yemenis like me, who's written over and over about the failure of the Stockholm Agreement and warned about it before it took place. Written about what's going to happen in the Red Sea in Israel if Houthis take hold of Hodeidah. And I spoke about it in depth. And that was mentioned, but that was glossed over. So I think it's a strategic mistake. I'm gonna see other questions and just kind of group them together. And also, Azad is asking, FARC in Colombia and the Taliban survived US pressure and returned through peace or force. Could the Houthis follow the same path and return to Aden? That's a scary concept to anybody who wants to take this. And as well, the Stockholm Agreement mistake question. Another question from Jamal Essa is, does the Yemen military actually have the green light to move in and take back some territories while the airstrikes are happening? Or are they not permitted to move an inch? And that's a bigger plan to have, I think, a commentary here, to have Yemen and Yemenis suffer longer and longer. So these are the current questions, is about military intervention, which is kind of complex given Saudi and UAE's role. And as it's a great question on, surviving the US pressure um, from the sanctions. Any volunteers to take these questions? We'll start with Asher.
Fatima, the entire Stockholm Agreement was worth it just for the photo ops. The miskin, the poor Yemeni delegates who had arrived to Stockholm in the middle of the winter. It was freezing cold. Many of them have never experienced temperatures anywhere below the freezing mark, and then had come there and thought, what kind of Jahannam were we brought to in the middle of the winter to negotiate on Yemen? It was kind of ironic. But that being said, this was one of those moments during the past 10 years where it seemed as if the Houthi movement had reached an endpoint. The conquest of Hodeidah by anti-Houthi forces looked as if it would become a reality. And that would have been a financial blow, but also a legitimacy and power blow to the Houthi movement. The UN intervened, perhaps misguided intervention and misguided diplomacy in the name of creating a ceasefire and protecting against civilian casualties, which again, ironically, created even more civilian casualties as the war then spiraled out of control after that point. But the Stockholm Agreement gave the Houthis an equal seat at the negotiating table and gave them in the eyes of the international community, a great deal of legitimacy, which made them an even more attractive ally to Iran, to Russia, and many others. So that's just a short piece in Stockholm that I think is one of those turning points. And certainly, Fatima, you've written extensively about Stockholm. But in terms of today, I don't, again, this is just reading the tea leaves. I can see a way in which ceasefires are enforced in 2025 the same way that they were in 2021 and in 2018. If there is a renewed campaign on the ground as these airstrikes are going on, even if there's actual coordination between US airstrikes and individuals, again, like Tariq Saleh, there may be that kind of, at least Tariq insinuates the fact that they're being coordinated with him. So there could be a possibility in which the airstrikes are timed to coincide with military movements on the ground. And I don't see that the global appetite is there for further legitimizing the Houthis if there is a renewed conflict in any of the flashpoints like Taiz, Hudaida, or Marib.
Yeah, so when it comes to Stockholm, I had a few thoughts just to build on what Asher was talking about. Um, yeah, I think that it was obviously a problem with the lack of enforcement mechanisms, right, on the ceasefire violations, and on also there were a lot of just in general, questions about that weren't unanswered. Like for example, the Houthis were able to claim that they were able to withdraw from Hodeidah and then transfer some of their uh, control of those ports to local surrogates and to locals. Militias that were aligned with them, and then there wasn't really a key way to enforce that. There also were some issues as to who would control the ports in Hodeidah after the Houthis were supposed to de-escalate and escalate and go get out of the conflict. The United Nations, from Martin Griffiths and the humanitarian side to the mission to support the Hodeidah agreement, really didn't have, the kind of resources or the kind of administrative structures or efficiency that were able to promote the delivery of humanitarian aid or to regulate the ceasefire. I mean, there were so many ambiguities that were built in. There was an inefficient UN structure, and there was also a lot of questions and loopholes that the Houthis were able to, in particular, exploit that really prevented it. But I think that moreover, which is what's going to make a ceasefire hard then, and also making a ceasefire hard now, is just the severe level and complete lack of trust between the warring parties inside Yemen. Right? Automatically, I mean the Houthis were viewing every coalition airstrike elsewhere as some kind of a way of undermining the Stockholm Agreement, and the Yemeni government was basically claiming that the Houthis were just using their position in Hodeidah and laundering the humanitarian aid that was going there to strengthen their military position elsewhere and handing over their resources to proxies and surrogates. So I think unless we get a better administrative structure in place, unless we have a ceasefire that's got clearer red lines and clearer enforcement mechanisms than we had with Stockholm, and less the core issues, which are the complete lack of trust between the warring parties, which is doubly strong now that the Houthis are even more Iranian proxies than local actors than they were then. I think that it's going to be pretty hard to get a kind of workable and operational ceasefire on the ground. It's going to be very different reconciling the Houthis and the other Yemeni factions than reconciling other factions of the Yemen conflict that have clashed with each other, like the Riyadh Agreement between the Southern Transitional Council and the Hadi government, which not only prevented North-South civil war, but now has led to the STC actually serving in coalition with the new Yemeni government. So the interregional legacies of conflict resolution are not easily applicable either to the Houthi Yemeni government dispute. And I think that also the mistakes of the Stockholm Agreement are doomed and destined to repeat themselves unless the entire architecture for dealing with this, especially at the UN level, is kind of really rethought and the stipulations are kind of overhauled.
Great, Sam. Thank you. I have so many good questions. I'm gonna just group them in three because of time. One question from Marcos Cayetano. I'd be interested in hearing more about Yemen's role in the complex relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We touched on that a little bit, but if someone has a concise answer, that would be great. Another question from C. Schuster. Thank you for the interesting discussion. In which sense is Taz a flashpoint, and where might it head to? I do like that question. And another from Becca Feathers. Do you perceive any efforts regionally, internationally, or within the legitimate government to plan for governance if the Houthis were to retreat or to be pushed from power? Any efforts to address the significant power vacuum that has hamstrung since 2016? We also kind of touched on this, but you can take you can answer whatever questions that you'd like. Maybe Sadiq, I'll start with you.
So let me take the question about the governance of the legitimate government. I think as we are talking, most of officials of the legitimate government are enjoying their time in Riyadh now, including the high-level officials and ministries. So even if Houthis are retreated and defeated, I don't think the government is ready to take this momentum. And we can see now, we haven't seen such a momentum now. Houthis have been choked by the USA strikes, and tribal leaders and tribesmen and in the ground, especially the anti-Houthi tribal leaders, are begging the legitimate government for a reinforcement to help them seize this opportunity, as Houthis in some areas are fleeing the areas actually because of the airstrikes. But the legitimate government hasn't taken and seized this opportunity and move militarily. So this is the wrong time for the legitimate government to be based in Riyadh. And so I think Yemenis have lost trust in the ability of the legitimate government to move positively and properly and seize this chance. So even if we defeat the Houthis, I think the hierarchy of the legitimate government is not ready even to function as proper government. The fractions among different players within the legitimate government, I think they first need to solve the problems within themselves and within their systems. Then we can talk about their ability to.
But that's kind of difficult because, in a sense, it's not functioning in a way where, a system or a constitution is enforced. They can't be subjected to any kind of questions for accountability or others. Transparency is an issue. A lot of handouts coming into the government. I mean, in a sense, this pursuit of maybe a perfect functional government may not be there, and it's the type of thing that Houthis have exploited for a very long time. I mean, they found their entry through the national dialogue. When we wanted to craft this perfect government for Yemen, they thought, okay, it's not going to happen, so we're going to just impose our vision. And to this point, there is one organized group. The STC is a very organized group, so you have the concern of a secession that can happen immediately, if you can't coalesce, or if we can't coalesce behind whatever is here and attempt to strengthen it. So you have all of these, problems, and I think the international community, if they start asking that question, in which they are not at the moment, we're going to face really real obstacles. But I believe that there's a problem in pursuing imperfection, because look at governments everywhere in the world. there's various degrees of imperfections, and dysfunction, including here in the United States. So I feel like we should just work with the cards that we've been dealt. And that's my opinion. Asher, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was the one that made that offhanded ties comment, so I'm glad that somebody picked up on it. If we can even recall, at certain moments during pre-2022, that there was Taiz was called a zone of stability. The At least the U.S. State Department called it one of the zones of stability, which included Marib and some areas outside of Hodeidah and Taiz. That's not the case necessarily anymore. After 2022, there were various different blockades, Houthi blockades around the city of Taiz. A lot of the agricultural areas were shut down, and the city and the areas around it, and much of it was divided. And there's still a lot of tension simmering under the surface in Taiz and around that area. And it's certainly conceivable that a conflict could renew, especially around Taiz, which previously was a flashpoint as late as 2022 and certainly could become one again. So that was a bit of conjecture, but based upon previous historical examples where Taiz was a conjecture. To answer Marcos's question about Iran, again, the Houthis were that model. Iran had one model that they operated with, is they found the marginalized group. They supported them and then watched as they destabilized the region with the help of political, economic, and military aid. That's certainly the case with the Houthis. They continue to destabilize the region. But at a certain point, as we've seen in the past few weeks, even Iran is beginning to distance itself from the Houthis because there's a serious concern in Tehran that any Houthi action can have repercussions not only on Sana'a, but on Tehran as well. And in terms of the last question of what could potentially happen, it's something that I began speaking about in 2015, that it seems that Yemen is never going to return to its 1990 form. Right? There was this kumbaya moment in 1990 where North and South came together. Everybody was singing in the streets. And then that quickly fell apart in 1994 with the Second Yemen Civil War and a fissure between North and South. And that really hasn't healed. And Yemen, prior to 1990, was never a unified country. And I think it'd be very difficult to get back to that point. So in many ways, you see autonomous groups within Yemen. Fatima mentioned the Southern Transitional Council, previously Al-Hirak. Al-Junubi has a very significant identity. They have a shared culture, political ideologies, very different than that in the rest of the country. And then you have Hadramis who have prided themselves in their autonomy for centuries. And then you have the northern regions, right? So I think there's three real regions that happen over here. And in many ways, that can be a federalist system, right? A weak central government with three autonomous regions seems to be the direction in which the country's headed. And certainly if international organizations and powers that want to find that solution, it may ultimately be in finding that trifurcated Yemeni federalist state with a weak central government in Sana'a, power sharing agreements, etc., between northern tribal groups. But I think that would require something similar to that happened in 1968. It would require the exile, the forced exile or the willing exile of the Houthi family out of Sana'a and out of Yemeni politics. And I think that would take away a lot of the tension and perhaps lead towards that potential federalist state.
Yemenis are hoping that they would have the same kind of fate as Bashar al-Assad, because no one thought that he could be dislodged this easily for some reason. And especially with the way that the Syrian structure have worked for a very long time, with mukhabarat being everywhere, and having this system that was decentralized system of governance that is very close to the Houthis, to be honest, where they have their supervisors and others that are taking control of the country. And to see all of that just change in Syria is kind of like it breathed some hope to Yemen. Sam, did you want to comment on any of the questions?
Yeah, a couple of quick points. It was really interesting from the others, but just a few things. I think that definitely we're looking at ties being an area where there could be an escalation between the Houthis and their domestic rivals. We're also seeing Taiz being a place where there's also a rise of anti-Houthi sentiments. So we're seeing some signs, for example, that the people who are sieging Taiz cannot break the Israeli siege of Gaza, like being one thing. There's been a lot of allegations that the Houthis are deliberately targeting Sunnis in Taiz and are not just trying to target in a sectarian fashion, and that's kind of creating frictions. The Houthis also have been accusing the United States in some of their strikes of also hitting the area. So I think that there's a lot of information warfare that's going around over here, and the Houthis are definitely escalating in Taiz. There's definitely been escalation, I think, have we seen since November, December of 2024. But whether they'll be able to actually gain traction there, break the impasse, recapture the city, get to a situation where they're fully, in control is doubtful, because I think there's going to be a lot of local resistance, even if they did make a more concrete military breakthrough and secure the area. And that could be a prototype or a view for local resistance in other areas of Yemen, like we were talking about in the scenario of local elites and local people kind of breaking down the Houthi movement in an unexpected, quick fashion. With regards to the Iran-Saudi relationship, yeah, I mean, Yemen obviously remains a sore point in that. I think that on the one hand, the Saudis are relieved, that the Houthis have not directed their missile strikes on Saudi oil facilities again and have not really crossed the border. But certainly there is a lot of discontent in Saudi Arabia towards the way in which Iran has handled this relationship with the Houthis. And we really saw that, I think, when Turki Faisal made an interesting speech at Chatham House. And he is a former Saudi official. He's got some license to talk. He was basically saying that, the U.S. strikes are pinprick strikes against a major threat. And also he said that Iran's continued support for the Houthis is a betrayal of what we signed under Beijing's mediation in March of 2023. So that goes to tell you that even though the Houthi-Saudi conflict has not heated up at this moment in time, Yemen remains clearly a major and sore point between the Saudis and the Iranians. And we see the Saudi commentators, we see ex-Saudi officials being much more vocal and hawkish about this than the current realm of Saudi officials, which are being a bit more cautious and just don't want the spillover to happen. So I do think that Yemen down the line is going to be a major area of contestation between Riyadh and Tehran, and also I think potentially between the Emirates and Iran, particularly when you look at how the STC, even early in 2024, when the Red Sea shipping attacks happened, were publicly calling for not just airstrikes against the Houthis, but also a potential international ground coalition against them. So I think that the UAE-Iran relationship is also being tested by this too.
Great points, Sam, as usual. We're 5 minutes to closing, so I'm gonna just ask you all in 1 minute, given, to answer me just in 1 minute, or to just give me your wrapping conclusions. With the renewed US airstrikes on Yemen, do you think the containment could be successful? And maybe a comment on, what the US can really learn from Saudi intervention over the past 10 years. Starting with Asher.
All right. Well, Fatima, thank you for arranging this panel. And I'll end maybe on a note of optimism. I think that the environment is very different today than it was in previous administration in previous years. The Yemeni people themselves have expressed a great deal of interest in ending this, and Sam alluded to it. But the great deal of optimism that I have is, in fact, there's Yemenis sitting in this digital room, but all over the world, who've been pushed into political exile because of the current Houthi administration. This concern for what happens mab'ad, what happens the day after the war. And I know I speak for one that I would be in the first plane to Sana'a the day afterwards to do what I can for my Yemeni friends, my Yemeni family. And I know that many Yemenis who are extremely talented, like Fatima, would do everything they could to make sure that the country that we love and we've invested a great deal of time and emotion into, would certainly be on its way to a much brighter future. So what happens the day after the Houthis? I think that it would be an opening for a much brighter future for the country. So I'll end on an optimistic note.
Sam?
Yeah, I do think obviously we're at a very parlous moment. I do think that the obviously the re-escalation of the Gaza war is going to lead to a continued reheating of the strikes on the Red Sea. If that hadn't happened, there probably wouldn't have been maybe as many. But then again, there were also many threats that Iran was and the Houthis were playing towards maritime shipping before 2023. So we shouldn't tie all of these threats to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait into commercial shipping only to the Gaza war, but certainly it does lead to a heating of the scenario in the short term. I do think that there's still the possibility that the U.S. is using these kind of overwhelming military strengths as some kind of an escalate to de-escalate strategy in terms of maybe engaging with Iran and tying this issue to the nuclear program. After all, one of the Republican criticisms of the JCPOA was that it didn't do enough to deal, or did nothing to deal with Iran's other regional activities in Syria with Hezbollah, but with Hamas, with the Houthis. So that could be somehow tied together. So I think that in the short term, there's multiple areas of escalation. There's multiple centrifugal forces. I do think it's going to be getting harder and harder to kind of really see a political settlement that can meld both the sectarian and regional grievances that we have in Yemen. But hopefully, in a future where the Houthis' lack of legitimacy, their beholdenness to Iran, and their internal sclerotic corruption kind of reveals itself, and there is some kind of transformational change in Sana'a, northern Yemen, there can be hope for a brighter and more peaceful future. I know that everybody here will be jumping to help Yemen in that scenario, as Asher said.
Thank you, Samuel and Sadiq.
Yes, I think the leaked signal message is a clear signal that of how the Yemen war is being managed, or let's say mismanaged by global powers. It's all about quick military hits like bombing Houthi positions to stop their attacks on Red Sea ships without a bigger plan to fix Yemen's mess. So I think what's missing is any sign of involving Yemeni partners properly, including the legitimate government. The government barely gets even a mention in this approach. So the government is totally ignored by the US and didn't give them real role or chance to participate in these operations against Houthis. But also, Fatma, let's not forget the humanitarian aspect of this mess. The situation in Yemen is incredibly tough right now. And with aid just approaching, many families can barely afford a meal, let alone buy new clothes for their children for Eid. So this issue has been buried by the geopolitical news. So Houthis nowadays use starvation, resource control, and fear to maintain their power and recruit more fighters like never before.
Thank you, Sadiq. And on that note, I want to thank you all for your participation. It's a very important issue. People's lives are being affected in Yemen, and we really, on that note, we really need the U.S. administration to pay attention to the lives of these people that are being affected by the quick decisions that are taking place. So thank you all for joining us. I want to thank the panelists, the participants, my team at the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies with Marwa Ghamrawi and Julian Ruxel, and of course Abdulsamad Al-Faqih. And you can watch this on YouTube and also on our channels, and there will be a summary of this event. Thanks again.